And to Marcos Novak, who actually teaches in the department and is a well-known trans architect, trans philosopher, trans ... transcends the art world, transcends the physical worlds, and now is actually involved in trying to figure out ways to create interesting interfaces between the physical and virtual worlds. Please welcome Marcos Novak.
Can we hook you up here quickly?
No.
Just your belt.
Hi. It's been an interesting day, considering that I woke up in Paris, and I'm here from the airport. So if I, in the midst of a sentence, seem to pause, you'll know what hit me. It's probably 2 a.m. or something for me, but that's fine. It's kind of fun, actually, to sort of roll in and come here. Yeah, do we have that working? No?
There it is.
Okay. Now, this is just some eye candy that will find its place in the talk as I proceed. The thing to perhaps observe about it is that it's supposed to be listening. Yeah, it is listening. So if I tap on the microphone or if I make funny sounds, it changes. This is just a regular program that you can get for not very much money. But it serves as a simple example of a notion of a kind of loop between the machine and our activity. That's something that's interesting to me. What I'd like to do quickly, I guess, tonight is run through some of the principal ideas that I've been working with over a rather long period of time, and then try to bring that forward to some of the things I'm doing now and the kinds of preoccupations that come into what I've been working on. Well, Victoria transduced me to you. So yes, one of the fascinations is with this prefix, trans, and how it pertains to what we're doing. We collectively, the sort of intelligent life forms on the planet, intelligent humanoid life forms on the planet. I can't speak for dolphins. Which seems to be characterized by that. But the word trans is actually one of a series of words and concepts that I've been building over a period of time that I want to sketch out quickly so that you have a frame of reference. It probably all begins with a notion of something I called liquid architectures a long time ago, which was a kind of recognition of a condition in which contradictory terms could be brought together, as in liquid and architecture. Also a condition of fluidity and change that was apparent not only in the field that I started with, which was architecture, but also more broadly in the kinds of things you would encounter in the cultural matrix. So there was a concern about that. And then a linkage to a kind of practical or praxis-oriented stance toward technology that in the end brought together ideas about information space and cyberspace, ideas about artificial life, and ideas about information theory and its relationship to what you might call beauty, and actually a series of experiments that tried to create things, build things that were beautiful by increasing their information content. But these various things always have a side to them which is oriented to making something, engaging the technology, a theoretical component which is then an effort to short circuit that kind of typical distance between theory and praxis, and then a broader cultural discussion. So the story begins with liquid architectures and becomes associated with virtual space. So I've done a lot of things having to do with virtual space, but it's not limited to that. And that led to a series of other concepts that had to do with the relationship of what's in the machine to the things that are out, which became something called trans architectures, and which led then to the cultural repercussion of that, which would be something you might call transmodernity. Now, what's all this about? We're witnessing a great deal of change. That's pretty evident. Institutions and cultures and ideas become unfixed, and definitions no longer hold, and new things come which have no definitions. In this condition, the components of things come together, and then when they come together, they merge for a while in a way that maintains a history to the separate roots of something, but that eventually separates itself and becomes a new kind of entity. So when that happens, you have this condition that I'll call trans, when something finally leaves its origins and becomes its own thing, the way, for example, cars have become independent of horses and carriages. I mean, you don't need to know about horses and carriages now to make a car. It's simply irrelevant. The car is trans to its origins. And that condition seems to be widespread, and consequently becomes a kind of idea about culture. Now, let me just associate these words with a few images so that I can go through them quickly and lead to the other things I'd like to talk to you about. Some of these things I'll go through very, very quickly so that we don't spend too much time. But they bear repeating, and I'm sure some of you have seen them, but some of you have not. So here's a quick image of space-time and the collision of the event horizons of two black holes beginning here and there, becoming a larger black hole. And you can take that as a kind of depiction of where we are in terms of our sort of collective understanding of space, but then also as an indication of where we are in a group like this, where you can say very clearly that these might be at one point separate disciplines that come closer and become multidisciplinarity, that begin to touch, if you cut through here, and become interdisciplinarity, and eventually become transdisciplinarity, which is a kind of condition that we seem to see. So there's an association between the way we know the world and the way we organize our epistemology of the world. Now, there are all these evidences that indicate that we live in a different space in which smart 10-year-olds can witness through a computer animation, of course, what the collision of two black holes might be like, and what the gravity waves would do under that situation, which is, of course, something that happens very, very fast at a very enormous scale that we normally wouldn't see, and yet somehow it's part of our culture to encounter these things, or to have the topography of Mars, or to have images like this which show all the satellites, the stray satellite parts that are floating around the Earth like a halo of flies, as part of our life. Okay, and then you've got these guys, or this particular person, who is arguably a combination of Charles and Marilyn, Charles Manson and Marilyn Monroe, and some kind of alien creature. And then the kind of forecast that you see from things like surrealism, which now have become true on the internet in places like Alpha World. Now this is an operation that refers to this transness and the kinds of things you see in, if you run through some of the cultural stuff. This is Magritte, of course, and you see here the figure of the mermaid, but the fish part is woman and the woman part is fish. That seems like the fun stuff that artists do. Until you see this very muscular cow from Belgium that's genetically engineered, and then this guy, which has come about having a human ear on its back by having the cartilage of an ear attached to it and then having its skin grow around the cartilage to create our own version of surrealism, but in this larger way. Now, here we're still talking about. I'm still talking about the. Actually, we don't need to see this. Let me escape this because it's taking us somewhere else. With that image of the mouse, we're still talking about the idea of trans, but we get to the point of the argument about there being a new kind of cultural condition that you might call transmodernity that is characterized by what I would call the production of the alien as a new kind of category. Perhaps in another time we would have been concerned with the production of man as a kind of concept, or the production of God, probably in the other order, God first, man second. Now the alien seems to be our preoccupation. So we've got the idea of liquid and the idea of trans so far. And of course, we're negotiating something about what happens behind the plane of the virtual and what happens in front of the plane of the virtual. I guess I haven't articulated it yet, but implicit in the idea of trans is that we are actually going from this culture of industrial civilization to one of information civilization, but to what? And that what seems to be the culture of virtuality. Now, we can elaborate that later, and maybe in the questions we can pick it up and see what might be meant by virtuality. But there's this concern. And one of the things that can be articulated at this point is that we have notions already, and significant efforts really, to put computation everywhere. We have ubiquitous computing as an idea, or more plainly, the idea that there are going to be computer chips just on everything you touch, which in the end becomes a kind of enabling technology. It's like someone develops a piano, but there's no music for it yet. So, okay, so every button on my shirt is going to be a supercomputer. So what? Something needs to be done with it. And one of the things that's been interesting to me is the idea that certain kinds of things occur in virtual space that will eventually find their way out into physical space. So immersion, which is what happens behind the screen, will turn into aversion, which is the turning inside out of virtuality onto the real world, well, they're both real, onto the physical world as we know it. Okay, maybe that's interesting. So where would that lead us? The third component in this kind of idea of a notion that might inform what you do, and a notion that reflects on the culture you're in, liquid architectures, a liquid culture, trans architectures, transmodernities. A third idea that seems to preoccupy me has to do with the invisible, the inherently unseen that can then somehow be retrieved into the sensible. So very quickly, images like these show the notion of a field and the idea that there are latent forms implicit in the fields around us, that the space that we perceive as empty is rarely so. and we have actually shapes and forms and behaviors all around us. The simplest example is probably the temperature on my body that creates an aura around me that interacts with objects, interacts with other people, merges with them, and so on. But there are other conceptions, many of them really. Here's a form derived from a field. You can see that you could change the form by picking a different intensity of the field. That's what these lines are. Or by changing those contours, and the object would change accordingly. There are other ideas, such as ideas of higher dimensions and things that are inherently invisible that can be retrieved through some kind of operation. So this is a three-dimensional object derived from a field, put into the fourth dimension, rotated in the fourth dimension, and then brought back as a shadow, which turns out for us to be this object that is rotating. But also, as you'll see, it's turning inside out, which is kind of a signature of the four-dimensionality of it. Then you can bring these back as particular kinds of designs. Here, these things are ambiguously placed as either proposals for strange buildings or proposals for buildings in cyberspace. And this is just like a quickie little slideshow of what these things look like. Another notion that we have is that space, from science again, that space might not be flat, that it might be curved. So this shows a torus in ordinary space, and the very same unaltered torus in curved space, but curved not the way a scientist would curve it, but more the way a sculptor would curve it. So if you had a sculptor who could curve space, what might they sculpt? When you put all of these things together, you arrive at artifacts such as this, where you have the form derived from a field, extruded in the fourth dimension, put into curved space, and then used polyphonically with variations of itself, the way it might be done in music. And each one of these images could be either a separate design, or it could be frames in the life of this thing as it evolves, because it's intended to be liquid and alive. And then here, very quickly, we'll just go inside and see this kind of nature. What's curious about this is that the accumulation of artifice seems to produce a kind of biological effect, a kind of aesthetic of some strange jungle made of materials from some other place. That too is a sense of the alien. And then you can retrieve any bit of this and bring it back and say, okay, I'll propose it perhaps as a building, perhaps as some kind of form. Now we're inside that form minus the structure, and we get to this slide, which turns out to be pretty important, where you have the strange control over the form that is enabled by working in an algorithmic way. But then you have these green bubbles. And the green bubbles are, in a sense, closer to where I am right now. They articulate that just as if you have a screen and you have a menu and you can point to the menu and alter the contents of the screen or the menu itself, have it reconfigure itself, those kinds of operations that occur in the flat land of the screen will indeed occur again in the three-dimensionality of our lived experience through this process called aversion, which is to say that if I can pull down a menu, I should expect that I could reach over here and pull out an area, a volume of space that I can interact with. That space itself becomes interactivated even though it's invisible. That was a lost applause from another country. What was that? Okay, these are other kinds of expressions, forms derived from some of the spatial characteristics that you find on the net instead of in physical space or in mathematical space. But let me bypass them for now and try to get closer to where things are. I've been working on a series, kind of a family of different installations for different places, it seems to have started with something I did in Vienna, which is what I'll show you here, and then a variant, kind of different animal went to Glasgow. I just came back from Paris, where I was putting something up at Orléans at a festival. I'm doing something for the Venice Biennale. There are other projects here in town, and then at the San Francisco Museum, and so on. There's a whole series of these things that explore a family of ideas that pulls the things I've been telling you together into this ambiguous trans thing that by itself has no simple name in terms of how you might categorize it. Now, these images that you see here, whoops, not that. No. Stop. Okay. This and a whole family of these things are images derived from fields that are made liquid and that are sculpted or painted, if you want to see them that way, which is a kind of sidebar, a kind of permission to treat things that are normally in the domain of science as materials for art. Why not? They're part of a projection that explores, in addition to the notions of multiple dimensions or more dimensions than we're accustomed to, the possibility of a kind of multiple time that we might be able, given the stimulus, be able to perceive more than one reality at a time. So this is a very, very slow and very limited example of what's actually installed, where there are perhaps 50 different things from which the computer picks 6 or 7, 5 to 7, I should say, probably, at a time, and interweaves frames from each of them, so that you get bombarded with this very high rate projection of many things, and you find out after a while that you can actually discern what is presented to you, although it's not perfectly sure. Sometimes you begin to see things that don't exist. Now, there are various kinds of two-dimensional forms, and then a cluster or a family of different kinds of three-dimensional forms, each one of a different kind, that are forms of the virtual. Now, this thing is loading up somehow. Come on, they're supposed to be moving. Hello. My hard drive seems to be on vacation. Let me interrupt myself for a moment and see if I can fix it. So we were there, I believe. Hello? Yes, will you cooperate? Well, let me. Okay, here we go. I think. Anyway, these forms perhaps will become agreeable shortly when the computer catches up with whatever it's trying to do. These are forms that are inherently fluctuating in time, and we'll see them somehow. I don't know what's going on here now. Maybe the thing to do is just bypass them. Stop that. Something is stealing my cycles. Is enough memory? Okay, one more time. See if we can get at least one of these to roll. There we go. Okay, so they behave in such a way they're part of this this projection system. Now, here's the Künstlerhaus in Vienna, where this was initially installed, and here's a view of the sort of format of the installation, which is, in one way or another, to have a very large display in which this idea of virtuality, multiple dimension, multiple time, can be shown. And then have sound. You can barely see these images. They're late night captures from the show. And then this mysterious pixelated object over here. Now there's a generative algorithm that creates music and also controls the video and has a kind of default behavior. It behaves on a principle of artificial life, and essentially has a population, a rather small population of these creatures that talk to one another. And the default behavior is that you hear their chatter, as if you've got some kind of animals grazing or something, and you just hear them going about their business. And that controls the sound and controls the particular way in which the video sources are all controlled. Then in front of that, well, this is another image of the whole thing. In front of that is suspended this form, which is something like a souvenir from the virtual, a kind of thing that you would retrieve or bring back from there. And it's built using rapid prototyping, literally made up of thousands and thousands of sheets of paper that are laser cut and laminated to create this form, which is ambiguous in the sense that it's mathematical and biomorphic at the same time, has a kind of sci-fi spaceship look to it, but also could be seen as a proposal for a certain kind of building. And in any case, it's just this occupies this ambiguous place. Here you can see in this image, you can see that it's actually one of the kinds of forms that appear in the virtual screen. And it's just, in this instance, in this installation, this kind of object is suspended this way. In different ones, it would be differently. But the long bar is there because it points out a void. So this bar, half of it is occupied by that, and then the other half is kind of empty. And then in the void is obviously some kind of technology. Something is there. And we'll just go around it. Let's take a look at it quickly. Now, the little sensor is something called a dimension beam. And it's actually a combination of an infrared emitter and an infrared sensor and a little lens, a little Fresnel lens, the combination of these three things produces a distinct shape in space that is kind of like a Brancusi sculpture, but also a kind of onion, in the sense that it has skins, and each skin triggers a different response from the computer. The whole thing then is tied into the sound and video generator, so that when you're looking at this bar and looking at that object that is retrieved from virtuality and brought, back in this kind of present rigid form, you eventually lean in and hit the shape. And when you hit the shape, the little grazing creatures that are making the sound and controlling the video become animated and annoyed, or whatever it is we attribute to them. Actually, what it is a max patch that where the numbers are running back and forth, and that's as alive as it really is. But you interrupt that the feedback in that system, and you notice it. I mean, things start getting animated, and once you know that it's there, if you're curious, you begin to find out what's going on. And initially most people will just kind of swing through, but eventually, if you slow down a little bit, you find out that you could just touch this thing. And if you just collect the touches that sound a particular way, you, point by point, build a form in space. And then you find out that you can actually squeeze it. And it squeals in different ways, because it's not just an empty form, it's actually a full form, just as, well, this object is, space, 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 carpet, carpet, carpet. That you can look at the whole room and realize, if you sampled it on a regular grid, there would be some points that would be attributed to being inside an object and some outside. And so this invisible object actually has an inside with values that are different than the outside. So in a curious way, here's some more of the object. You see the void. This here is the Brancusi I was talking about, just for reference. And then I think another one someplace around here. Yeah. And this is just photoshopped in to give a sense of this kind of field that you can interact with. The curious thing is that you've got this very active, very big screen. You've got sound. You've got this form. You've got all these things. In the end, the most invisible thing winds up getting all the attention. That, in essence, the interactivity associated with the invisible is more powerful than the formal, than the visual, than the auditory, than the animated. Just the fact of its presence seems to command attention once you know it's there. Now, it's a radical proposition in certain ways, because it proposes an invisible sculpture and turns on its head the idea that somehow sculpture or art is voyeuristic. It goes back to Duchamp maybe, and the sort of idea of a non-retinal art. On the other hand, even though it's non-voyeuristic, it is a hyper-tactile, because the only way to know it is to try to interact with it. And curiously, what happens is sensual in a kind of trans way, because there's nothing there to sense. First of all, you're always sensing it synesthetically. There's nothing. There is no feedback on your fingers directly. You either sense it because you hear it, or because it controls the video, or because it opens your garage door, or whatever it is that it does. So the hypertactility comes from an observation such as this: that if I'm a painter, say, and I want to make a painting that requires that you look at color in a kind of serious way, I wouldn't put colors that are highly contrasting side by side, because, well, blind people could see those. If I wanted really to test the acuity of your color vision, I would put colors that were very subtly different, or almost not different, and then you would really have to detect color carefully. By the same token, then, if you have a shape that you can only touch, but in the lightest of touches, it's as if, this is not scientific, this is sort of my impression. But it's as if your sensors become hyperactive, as if you're trying to caress with the lightest caress you're capable of. Like you're touching the baby's face or something, you're trying to touch it as lightly as possible. And here's this object that's not even there. But those are reversals that have to do with sculpture. The further implication, because this is still, as odd as it looks, still both an object on its own right, but also a kind of proposition for architecture, both in the virtual and the physical, and especially in this instance, the physical, that it's a matter of time before that becomes a building. The proposition is that you can construct an architecture that is invisible. And the further proposition in terms of, say, interface design is that we are still captive to that screen, or to this screen, or to that screen, in our relationship to technology, and that we are perhaps at the time where we can, if we accept that our relationship to virtuality might be sometimes, not always, invisible, then we might be able to construct things that we can take outside into the sun or the rain or to the beach, or we can put on our clothes, that basically we can construct an architecture within this space that is invisible divisions of the space, or bring it outside and occupy the spaces that we normally wouldn't want to cover with gadgets, with these invisible presences. Okay, we'll go around a little more. Here's a person sort of trying to find the shape, trying to touch it. There's just a recollection of those forms. And here are those green things that I said were important, because these things actually came before I ever made this project, and there were the intuition that such a thing should happen, and then I found how to do it. There are actually many ways to do it, and the reason I started off with a little image of the microphone-induced eye candy was to suggest that every sensor that we know can be brought into this, and that actually every sensor that we have, anything that detects something, doesn't detect it everywhere. It actually has a shape in space. And so if you attend to it, you can go quite far. Now, this little image is of motion capture, the way you would use it if you were doing animation, if you wanted to capture a dancer and map the motions of the dancer to a dinosaur, or whatever it is that you needed. What you would do is you would put sensors on the points of interest of the person, and these things typically are electromagnetic, although you can do it with sound and other technologies, infrared light again. But they have resolutions that are to the thousandths of an inch, thousands of times per second, and what that means is that it's possible, with a little mental trick, to go from the idea of rendering on a screen to rendering in space to rendering in sensitive space or sensorial space. We all know the idea of the pixel, so these little things here are pixels. It means picture element. Now, if you've played with other software, you've heard the word texel, which is texture element, or the word voxel, which is volume element. So one thing I'm proposing is that we should have a word that logically might be sensal, or sensor element. And what that word would signify would be the ability to take a volume of space, like a little cube of space, as small as you would like to make it, and have it available the way pixels are available. And we know that if we have a grid of pixels and they can take colors, we can render any picture we like on that grid. That's pretty easy. Well, by the same token, if I have a grid of these sensors, if I fill this room up with a series of small little boxes, each of which can say, oh yes, I know you're touching me, then what I can do, in the very same way that I can render that picture on the screen, is scan this person here, and or any one of you, and just the bust, just the hand, just the whole body, whichever, and render it exactly to the resolution of my stencils as a form in space that becomes available as an avatar, as a kind of ghost or angel, or some other presence that can't be seen but can be actually touched, and actually touched with precision, down to thousandths of an inch, so that we could actually feel the smooth top, like this one. All right. What's more is that I'm trying to make an association between this kind of rendering and this notion of rendering in space and computer graphics. Because we know, or we take for granted now, that we can make dinosaurs, we can make Terminator 2, we can make, name your favorite special effects. We can make things come to life in computer graphics, and we can make things morph from one thing to another, move around. All those things then become available as regions of space that can not only exist as sculptural form, but can actually be animated through space to either represent us or to become available to someone to do something, or for whatever practical or artistic reason we have. But it's an enormous category. The idea of having spent all of previous history in space that was somehow innocent, and to now reach a state where the space is no longer innocent, is actually a very huge possibility for fun and mischief, for good and bad, for whatever it is you're looking for. Now, here I'm just going to sketch out. This is something I'm working on right now, but because I'm working on it frantically, I don't have all the images. I mean, there's no time to document everything. So I'll show you some of the things that I have and describe to you the rest. I've been invited to represent Greece, where I grew up and whose passport I still carry, at the Venice Biennale this summer. And this is just a schematic of the building. This is the entry, and I have there are various other installations, but I have basically the core part of it. Is there a laser here by any chance? No? Use the mouse? I guess I could use the mouse. Okay. Use the mouse. Oh, no, I can't use the mouse because I'm in slide mode. Well, I'll just use the shadow, okay? So basically what I have is something here. Oh, look at this. Excellent. A long finger. There's a back wall in which there's going to be a large projection. There's going to be some kind of partition here, and a series of artifacts over here, and some wing projections on the sides, and then a strange thing in between. The components are pretty much the same, but the particular instances of them will be different. Let me just do the guided tour part, and this is fun here. Your installation can be put anywhere you want. Great. Thanks. I guess. So one of the curious things is that the partition itself is going to be quite a fun thing to see, because it's going to be from tip to tip 7 meters, and then 3 meters tall, and then this isn't the actual piece. It's changing, but the depth of it will probably be around 3 meters too. But it'll construct a kind of shell. And these are some views of this kind of machine-made aesthetic, and then this is another kind of rendering of it. But yeah, again, the thing is, it's pretty large. Person's about that big. About there. So on the inside of it will be an alternating array of visible and invisible forms with when we have a three-dimensional object and we want to represent it in 2 dimensions, we typically make a plan and 2 elevations, or sections and elevations and so on. It takes several renditions of a lower dimension to represent an object of a higher dimension. We saw the 4-dimensional things earlier. So one of the things that's curious is that if you have a 4-dimensional object and you really want to do it justice, you can't make one rendition of it. You would have to make at least 4 to account for the different permutations of what projection you're making. So if you have x, y, z, w as 4 physical spatial dimensions, you can take x, y, z and make a projection. You can take x, z, w and make a projection. You can take y, z, w, and so on. And consequently, in this and in some other installations, there's this exploration that I'm working on how to retrieve these 4-dimensional objects and bring them forward, interspersing them with the invisible. So there'll be invisible forms, visible forms, invisible forms, visible forms. Then sound and video as before. Then on in the space in between that I described, the sort of space like this, through the use of cameras and the reverse idea of a projection, there'll be forms suspended in space, invisible forms suspended in space that you can encounter or bump into as you might. And these, I still have to play with them to make sure. Well, I mean, I know it'll work, but it's a question of how subtle it is and whether or not people will be able to detect it. But as I was saying before, even with simple technologies, you can make the forms move in space. So you could have a sculpture, kind of moving, changing liquid sculpture in this space of forms that were just moving around. And if you weren't attentive, you would just think that it's some kind of sound installation, say, or a light installation. But if you were attentive, you would be able to catch up with them and interact with them. Okay, so that's anyway. There's more to this, and there are more variants of these projects that I could talk about, but I haven't had any time to load any images. So I think I'll stop with that and try to wrap up and conclude with something. Okay, the liquid, the trans, idea of aversion and the alien, eventually the invisible. I seem to be growing increasingly interested in the relationship of sense to the invisible. There's a kind of notion of simple creatures, say like amoeba, existing on a 2-dimensional world, and really having perception of just the 2-dimensional world. No apparent response to the 3rd dimension. And yet we have this idea of evolution, and we have this idea that, we were once simple, and now we're what we are. But no particular reason to think that should stop there. So just as an amoeba might not have a suspicion of the 3rd dimension, though there is one, we might not have a suspicion of other things that are invisible, though they are there. So I'm reading a book now called Sensory Exotica, A World Beyond Human Experience. And it's all about the senses of creatures that can perceive things in the environment that we can't. and the detailed ways in which these things happen. So, for example, bats, dolphins, birds that can navigate by detecting directly the Earth's electromagnetic field, creatures that communicate through electrical signals in the depths of the ocean. Well, there was this one number here that really caught my attention, that made a lot of sense to me, and I think explained to some extent the nature of this curiosity that I have. I mean, implicit in the curiosity is, of course, that we're not done, that we might be changing. But, well, what we perceive is vibrations in the electromagnetic spectrum. So temperature, light, sound, they're all of a certain kind of phenomenon, and we can detect that. But the portion of it that we perceive is a small part of all that there is to perceive. Now, what's curious is just how small that part is. Like, if it were, say, the length of this wall, what do you think we actually can perceive of that? If all that there was to perceive was mapped on the length of this wall, what portion of this wall do you think you can actually see and detect with your senses? Anybody?
Is that a question?
Yeah, that's a question. A brick? No. He says a brick. Anyone else? 5 meters?
5 inches.
5 inches.
The energy spectrum doesn't use the same scale. So if we were to map it to a linear scale, it would be very small. The electromagnetic spectrum, the light portion of the spectrum is extremely small. It would be a hair if you were to artificially map the sensor,
But it's what we call light,
yes.
right? But how small is small? How small? If this were the whole spectrum,
It would be a hair.
it would probably be a hair or less. The number, I mean, you have to rely on some things, right? You have to find something. So here's the number. The number that you would have to, well, I guess we'd have to ask this. If what we perceive is a hair, all that can be perceived is a number which is the number 3 with 35 zeros behind it. So, I don't know, I think I don't know what that number is, but I have a feeling if you took a hair and multiplied it by this number, you'd probably reach the sun. You know, it's a very huge number. And what we actually see of reality is just tiny. But here we are with all these gizmos, and we can do something about it. We can actually take different parts, and we see it all the time. I mean, one of the ways we can see, the nebulae that seem to come back on a regular basis now, is because we're not really seeing. So I'm curious about that, and I'm curious also about making it, finding ways to not be curious in an idle way or just a theoretical way, which isn't idle but somehow is not engaged with the mechanisms by which things happen, but to actually take the two together and map them. And one of the nice things about a book like this is that it takes the sonic mechanism, the sonar mechanism of a bat, and explains it in such detail that you could finally write a max patch, and make your program have its own sort of perception of the environment. Okay, well, I think that's where I'll stop. And if there's discussion and questions, I'd be very happy to hear them.